Welcome back to another video on dynamic range. So I'm gonna give you a introduction to dynamic range because in reality this subject might be more advanced and difficult than I can even comprehend. So dynamic range goes deep, but this would be the introduction, guys. So if you already know about dynamic range, this may not be the video for you. But if you're completely new to photography or videography and you just want a simple explanation, then this might be the video you need to see. So in my previous videos, I explained how to increase the dynamic range on the Canon M50. But I didn't explain what dynamic range is. So that's the video. And to make it simple, I'm gonna bring out the trusty gray card and my trusty top cam, the Canon M50. So I need you to imagine that what you're seeing down here is a photograph or a video, and the black swatch here represents the darkest shadows in the scene, and the white point over here represents the brightest point in this scene. The red line represents the dynamic range. So right now we've got a dynamic range of 2 because we're able to gather information from this swatch and that swatch. We can tell them apart. There'll be details within these lines. But since this swatch over here falls outside of the dynamic range, it will be rendered as a pure white. In RGB values, that would be 255. Same goes for this one, and if we have more swatches, same for this one over here. So anything beyond this line will be rendered as 255 or a pure white. Anything below this line over here will be rendered as a pure black. In RGB values, that is 0. But the thing is, we can decide if we want to get details in the highlights of the scene or in the shadows, the darker parts of our scene, simply by exposing to one side or the other. Okay? So this way we're able to gather details from over here, but we're losing more details in the highlights. Right now we're exposing for the middle. That's usually fine, but with a dynamic range of only 2, we're only able to see these 2 swatches. In real life, the dynamic range is much larger, but the scene may also be very contrasting. And in the end, dynamic range is basically just how great your camera is at recording contrast, so to say. How great is it to notice the small difference from the blackest point to the whitest point before it says, right, now I can't see any more details over here, I'm just gonna render it as a pure white, and these are the darkest point I'm able to register. Anything below that, pure black. In photography terms, we call it clipping the highlights or crushing the shadows. But let's say we have a camera of 3 stops of dynamic range. Now we're actually able to gather details from 3 different level of brightness before we get the clipping or the crushing of the shadows. Alright? Hope you follow along. And if we then extend it to 4 stops of dynamic range, we're now able to get 4 swatches. And you guessed right, if we increase it even further to 5 stops of dynamic range, we only have to sacrifice either the brightest part of the image or the darkest part of the image. But we can't have both. Okay? To have the whole spectrum in this image, we need a dynamic range of 6, so we can gather details from the darkest point of the scene to the brightest point of the scene. If the scene had a bright light, we will need even more dynamic range to gather that, plus the darkest part. But the thing is, we can just move our exposure to one side, and then we're able to get way more details in the highlights, but we will sacrifice the darker part of the image. And that's just how photography is and video. So at the end of the day, dynamic range is basically how great is your camera at both seeing details over here in the darkest part of the image and in the brightest part of the image. When will it clip one or the other? If you have a bright window behind you and you're trying to expose for the face, you will likely see a clipping of the highlight because you were trying to rescue as much details on the face and you exposed for the shadows. That makes sense because it's after all better to have details on the subject's face than it is that you can see the garden outside. Okay? But if we take it one step further and we keep on this idea of dynamic range as a line or a range that you can move, you could say that the human eye have a pretty substantial range of dynamic range. We can see a lot with the human eye. We can look into a bright area like a window and still see the shadows under a table perfectly fine. A camera is not as good, and the dynamic range could be much smaller. And we would have to say, alright, we're going for the highlights or the shadows. Some cameras have more dynamic range than others, and some cameras offer to shoot in log, and then it actually compresses or manipulates how the light and shadows are saved into a flat profile, but in the end, when we transfer it to a monitor in a Rec 709 kind of way, we will lose that dynamic range still, but we get the data from the log to make the decisions later on to say, right, we drop the highlights, or we drop the shadows, or we have a really flat image and have details in the whole image, but it doesn't really make sense. Then we have something like a smartphone, which has a tiny sensor and is usually not great at dynamic range. But it may actually be better than a camera that doesn't have log, for example, because smartphones have built-in AI. So the AI is gonna say, all right, you've got a really bright sunny sky behind you. I'm just gonna manipulate that as a bit darker to keep the details while recording. A camera is not that smart, at least not yet. It may come someday. Same thing goes to the shadows, like, alright, your face is underexposed because you have the bright sun behind you. We're just gonna lift the shadows and record that straight into the video. So that's why some people will experience that smartphones have better dynamic range. And it's true, and it's not true. The camera is just so smart that it's actually able to manipulate the highlights while recording. The camera records what it sees, writes it down, and that's how it is. So you can't really compete against the human eye in terms of dynamic range, but you can choose what's important for the scene, important for the story, and you don't need a massive dynamic range to shoot great videos or take great photographs. There are ways around it. For example, if you have a dynamic range, let's say with your camera, that is quite small, let's put it this way. If this is your dynamic range on your camera and you want to have a photo of the entire scene, well, you can expose to the left, expose for the shadows, then take another picture where you expose for the highlights, and then you combine the two photos and you get a photograph with details of both the shadows and the highlights, which is usually done for HDR photography. So this goes crazy deep, and I watched a video yesterday just to refresh my knowledge, and it goes so deep that my brain didn't comprehend everything, because the way the camera views things is in linear fashions, but the human eye is better at recognizing differences in the shadows than in the highlights. So cameras apply curves and everything to simulate the human eye before the monitors does the same thing with powers again, and it is confusing. But just know that dynamic range is basically how great your camera is at recognizing details in the darkest part of your image and in the brightest part of the image. Cool. So I hope you learned something. Don't feel bad if some of this went over your head, because it is complicated and I'm still learning myself, but this is the way I imagine dynamic range, at least. It helps me get an idea of exposing for either highlights or shadows. And yeah, I hope you found this video entertaining or you learned something, and if you did, well, leave a like, subscribe, please write a comment if you have any questions. I answer all of them, and yeah, that's all I have. So take care and bye.